So I've outlined some of the learning objectives that we've got today, and it's to help people to appreciate the need to focus on a particular type of customer, understand techniques for finding out what sorts of customers are out there, and then to be able to decide what customers you want to attract. So what we're going to be doing really is looking at strategies that will enable new businesses to focus on problems and opportunities in order to take the most needed or promising product or service forward. If that doesn't make sense right at this moment, it should make sense by the time we get to the end of the session. The material that we've got is aimed at people really thinking about starting a new business, or who are in the first stages of setting up a new business and want to know a little bit more about how to find customers. So we're going to be looking at some marketing theories, and Ben in particular will be focusing on marketing theory, marketing strategy, but in a very practical and useful context, because our focus is always on reality and what actually works rather than nice fancy theories. Before we start, we'll just give a little bit more background into us. I know Peter has introduced us very nicely, and thank you for that, but just to say a little bit more about our business and put us into context. We're an innovation consultancy based in Kings Lynn. And again, innovation, it does sound very fancy, but what it really means is that we help businesses and organizations to develop and implement processes to get things working better. Our focus is really on working within geoscience, environmental and social enterprise sectors. And that's really, as I said, it's about practical innovation. So whether that's creating a better product, a better service, or a better environment, it's all about trying to make improvements. On a personal level, as Peter's mentioned, I'm Tracee, and my business partner, Ben, who's co-presenting. We're both on LinkedIn, so do, as I said in the chat, feel free to connect if you can. My background is HR and training, so I'm very much sort of I'd say the mouthpiece of the organisation, but I focus very much on delivery and facilitation and that kind of thing. Ben can be a little bit more background, but equally he does a lot of presenting and sort of facilitation as well. Background very much geoscience, product management and those kind of things. So he's the brains behind the organisation, really, as will probably become apparent as we go through. Just to say a little bit about you, I suppose. So we want to say at this point, as someone looking to strike out and make a start on your own, then we absolutely wish you the best of luck. You know, we've been there, and to some extent still are, I suppose. We're still finding our way, as all businesses are. And it's a hard process, but it's obviously a really rewarding one. We're finding it very rewarding. And I think, you know, don't lose sight of the fact that by being here today, you're really taking a step in the right direction. So to get a little bit of interaction going, don't worry, we're not going to sort of put you in groups or make you say anything, but we'd really like to start by just getting you thinking about your own business or your own business idea and how you think about business. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask a question. What I'd like you to do is just think about your business idea and which of these statements on the screen you agree with the most. As I said, it's not a trick question. It's just to get you to think about yourself as a business person. And I'd like you to pick either statement A, statement B, or statement C. You don't have to share it. Just jot it down on a piece of paper. You're welcome to share it in the chat if you want to, but we won't sort of go through it and sort of pick any holes in anyone's thinking. If you think that it's most important to pick your best idea and create something around that for a business, then write down A. As I said, you don't have to share it, just make a note. If you think that it's most important to ask other people what they need and base your plans on the greatest need, then note down B. And if you think that whatever the nature of the business, being good at sales and being a good salesperson is most important, then note down C. So I'll just give you a second to digest those and sort of see what your thinking is. Okay, so just to move on. So Whether you put A, B, or C demonstrates what orientation you take towards business. So if you think it's about ideas, then you have product orientation, so you're product oriented. If you think it's about need and what other people's needs are, then you're market oriented. And then if you think it's about selling, then it's a sales orientation and you're more sales oriented. So as you can probably imagine and probably sort of even think quite intuitively, all three are important, but it's good to have an idea of what your instinct is and then work accordingly. I think whatever your instinct, as someone starting a business, you need to ensure that you are pivoting towards that market orientation early on. And that's really what's going to be the focus of what we're talking about today and covering during this session. Because if you think about it, you might have a really good product, but what's the point in making something if you don't know people will buy it? And similarly with selling, how do you sell something when you don't know who you're going to be selling to? So before you start busting a gut making and trying to sell something, you need to be certain that there's a market out there for it. And I think how we sort of start with this, and our golden rule really, is to make yourself aware that you are not your customer. And this is a golden rule that Ben and I certainly live by. You are not the customer. And it is a common trap to fall into, and instinctive really, because you can assume that because you know what you want, then you know what other people want. But trying to start a business, we're trying to attract other people. So we can't assume that other people have the same needs and desires as we do. So just as a starting point, just keep coming back to that idea that you are not your customer. And we have got an example. So we're going to use the example of Becca. So this is Becca. Becca works as an HR manager, or worked as an HR manager, and her dream has been to open her own cafe. So Becca's taken a redundancy package from her employer and decided to use the £10,000 that she was given as a payout to start a new business. So she's finally going to open up her luxury brand cafe, Cafe Luxe. So Becca lives in Kings Lynn, where there are a number of successful cafes, both independent and large chain. So she thinks a unit at the top end of the high street with low rental will be ideal and won't eat too much into her costs. So she takes a lease, she gets to work on decorating to her personal taste, which is French chintz. She buys a fancy coffee machine and puts together a tasteful menu. So let's have a look at what happens over the first couple of months of Cafe Luxe. Not great things, as it turns out. So Becca gets a few walk-ins on day one, and then people slowly start to trickle in over the first couple of weeks. So things are looking okay. She does a Facebook ad. That seems to do the trick for a couple of weeks. Things are working. She even runs out of some of her supplies due to demand. But after a few weeks, things start to get a little bit quieter. She closes early on a couple of days. She doesn't sort of follow up on the hours that she's advertised. And then by month 3, she's very sad to find that people just aren't turning up anymore. Some days just no one comes through the door. The coffee machine needs servicing. It all just feels like the dream is dying. So let's have a look at what Becca did wrong. Becca didn't have a strategy, and Ben's going to come on to talk about strategy shortly, but I think a lot of businesses and a lot of people, and again, this can be a little bit of an instinct, is that you think that if you build it, they will come. And I think, you know, it's a famous line from a film, isn't it? And it might work in heartwarming movies, but in real life, it almost never, sadly, if you build it, they will come. Just doesn't happen in real life. So in the example of Becca, she's sort of been consumed by what she wanted to provide. So what she wanted, and then neglected to consider whether it was something that people actually wanted. She didn't have a strategy, which sadly is inviting failure. So Ben's going to pick up here and start going through why that approach doesn't work, so that we can then start building on what does work.
Okay, thanks, Tracee. This will be the bit where you realise that I'm not quite as polished a presenter as Tracee is, but let's see how we get on. So over to me. As Tracee said, I'm kind of interested in the strategic drivers for what leads to a successful business, and I'm going to talk a bit about some marketing strategy and marketing theory here. So we've got this concept of if you build it, they will come. And it's such an easy mistake to make. Because it leads us to idealize our notions of starting a business, and we focus, and it's a very human thing to do, to focus on what we can create and what we're offering, rather than thinking about what people actually want. And it sounds a very obvious thing, but it's actually a very profound, different point of view. And I'm using this quote from a guy called Peter Drucker, who you might have heard of if you've looked into the history of sort of management thinking and strategy. So Peter Drucker was doing work over several decades, but I think sort of around the 60s, he was doing some books which even stand the test of time now. And I've taken a quote from one of those, and it's a well-known quote that the purpose of a business is to create a customer, which seems like a bit of an odd phrase when you first see it. The more you think about it, the more it makes sense. It's that a business and its customers are two sides of the same coin. And unless a business sets out deliberately to create a picture of its idealized customer, then it potentially is going to struggle with things like focus. So the problem is when you start to focus on what you want to do and what you want to provide and the things that you want to create, like Becca did in the fictional cafe example, you utilize something that we would call supply side thinking. So you're thinking about what you can create and what you can supply. And this slide here is to try and describe, I used the phrase two sides of the same coin. The business is one side and the customer is another. And this diagram here is trying to illustrate that to some extent. What happens if you look at a lot of traditional business training, or if you've picked up sort of an intro to business planning or anything like that, like a book, a lot of it focuses on the left-hand side of this equation, which is the business. And this is what we call the supply side. So the business is obviously going to create products or services, and it's going to supply those to the market. And the things that this area starts to get you to think about is the kind of mechanical, logistical things that go into a business. And if you've ever thought about, or if you've ever been kind of pushed to do a formal business plan, these are the things you're going to talk about. What finance are you going to need? Who are your suppliers? Where are your raw goods going to come from if you're making something? What space do you need? Premises. What kind of staff do you need? How are you going to find them? How are you going to make sure they've got the right skills? And then also all the administration and the systems that go behind it. So the setting up of a kind of a structure that you can use to create and provide products and services. And if you've been through the process of setting up a business, or if you've been through the thought process of how you might do it, and you've come to the point of a business plan, you've probably thought a lot about these things on the left. But the point behind what we're talking to you about today, defining your customer, is that you need to also think about the other side of the equation, or the other side of the coin, which is the customer. And this is what we call the demand side thinking. So the market, like every day, we buy products and services, whether we think about it that way or not. And we are the market. The consumer or the customer, however you want to say it, is the market, and they create a pull. So the businesses push products and services into the market, and the customer or consumer demands things from the market. Okay, and what you often get with this is down the middle. There's a big grey box that says product/market disconnect, and this is a very common problem with businesses, that if we don't consider both sides of the equation, there's a complete disconnect, and it might not then be obvious in the moment why the business is failing. And what we need to think about on the right-hand side of the equation is what the customer cares about. So on the left are all the things, the mechanical things that you care about trying to set your business up. On the right-hand side, customer doesn't care about any of that. The customer, they have desires, they have anxieties. They wish for things, or they're experiencing problems they need to fix. They also operate under certain constraints. So they might have financial constraints, they might have time constraints, they might not be able to put too much mental energy into decision on buying a product. We also need to think about what context they're in, what situation they're in, because different products might serve different situations. And importantly, what alternatives are in front of them, because these aren't necessarily the competitors that you think they are. So, for example, the alternative to a visit to a cafe might be to stay home and make a coffee at home and go to a supermarket and buy some ground coffee. So you're not necessarily competing with who exactly you think your competitors are, because your customer thinks of the alternatives in a different way. And you probably didn't think too much about these if you went through a traditional business planning process. And all of this is really, it's what we call the demand side of the equation. And it's about the desired outcome that the customer is trying to achieve. And even the customer themselves might not be able to articulate it directly. And we'll come on to techniques for how we explore that in a moment. Now, this concept here of supply side and demand side is explored in a very useful book that we would recommend to you. We're going to put a link to that in the chat. So this book is quite interesting because if you've ever picked up a business book before, they can be quite dry. This is more a book about, I would say, the psychological elements of how people choose a particular company or a particular product and how they go through that journey. And what we're going to look at in a few moments through the rest of the course is how we can get ahead of that and meet the customer where they are and understand what problems or aspirations they have, so that we can try and align ourselves. Okay, so if we think about the question that Tracee presented to you a little bit earlier on, the three orientations, the product orientation, the market orientation, and the sales orientation, what this model of how the customer works versus what the business cares about leads us to suggest that actually option B, the market orientation that takes into account what the market is struggling with or what the market desires and what constraints and context they're within, is perhaps the easiest way to figure out who your customer is and how you can present something to them, a product or a service that they will pay for. Okay, so this isn't to say that the other orientations, the one where you come up with an idea and build it, or the one where you have a product and you put your effort into the sales, they can both work. What we're suggesting here in this module, this training, is that market orientation actually is just the easiest way to get to a viable business. Okay, so before we move on from this slide, I'd just say we definitely recommend this book. It's not too long. Have a look at it, and it will unlock some interesting concepts for you if you've been struggling with this idea of who is the customer in the past. So next slide. So how do we fix this problem? Because it's all very well saying, in theory, you need to have a market orientation because that's just the best way of getting to a viable business, right? How do we do it in practice? The Peter Drucker quote about the purpose of a business being to create a customer, okay, it's quite vague. Like how do we actually deal with that in practice when we're on the ground trying to make our own small business or new business or startup work? Okay, the starting point is always market research. Okay, this is not a step that you can skip. So in the finding your customer journey, you have to do some research. And there's quite a lot of evidence out there to suggest that the highest performing companies in the world, on average, they are the highest performing companies because they know more about their customers than their competition do. So they don't obsess about their competition, and they don't obsess about their internal structure, although both of those things are important. They fixate on their customers. And market research helps you to basically test and tackle your assumptions about who the customer is and what the market looks like, and to identify specific groups of customers who might be worth trying to attract. So there's two types of market research fundamentally, secondary and primary. So that's enough from me for the moment. Tracee's going to look at these different types of research.
Great, thanks, Ben. So we're going to start with secondary market research because this is technically the easier starting point. Secondary market research is basically using existing information about your chosen industry to help you get a general overview. So research can tell you things like whether a particular market is big enough, who the main competition is, and what the barriers might be. And I've outlined there some examples of traditional methods of secondary research. So a very, very basic starting point would just be online research. So going on Google, Googling your idea, Googling what's around, what's local, what's not local, and just getting an idea of what your idea is to put it into some sort of realistic context. Library and local authority databases are useful, obviously, and Peter will be very pleased with me. Here, I've looked up COBRA, which is the local Norfolk database that we have here. I don't know if it's a national thing. Peter, correct me if I'm wrong.
It is a national thing.
It is a national
available
thing.
in all the Norfolk libraries, and it's the absolute best thing for you're starting off when you've got a business idea. We also have access to Mintel and IBIS World, which are fantastic market research ones at King's Lynn Library. Sorry, it's enough plug there.
No, that's fine. But we used COBRA early on, didn't we, in the first incarnations of our business, and it was really helpful. More so than just go, there's a lot more than just going on Google. You can get a lot of sort of demographic detail and that kind of thing, just as a very basic starting point. Obviously, things like trade journals and industry publications can help. Associations and trade organisations, so Chamber of Commerce, Federation of Small Business, they will do. They'll give a lot of help even to small businesses who aren't members. That they're usually trying to sort of encourage you towards membership, but even before that stage, you will still get a lot of help as a non-member. And then just magazines and news articles can help as well. As I said, secondary research is a good starting point, but it's not enough in itself. You also have to make sure that when you're using and doing secondary research that you're being very objective with it. So you're not using it to reinforce your biases and ideals, but you're taking a very practical view of what the data is telling you. As I've said earlier, we do try and trust our instincts, and it is hard to be detached when you're trying to make your dreams come true. I think what I usually say to people is that when you're doing your research at this stage, just sort of tell yourself that you're doing it for someone else. And that way, it just helps you to try and be a little bit more impartial with it. Once you've done enough secondary research, you can then move on to primary market research. Now, this is where you as the researcher are directly involved in collecting data. So you're not just looking at data someone else has collected, you're actually actively collecting data yourself. And the most valuable kind of primary research is talking to potential customers to learn what they care about. And this is going to do lots of things to help you. It's going to help you to establish viability. It's also going to tailor things like targeting and positioning, which we are going to come to talk about later on in the training. If we go back to Becca and sort of trying to establish what primary research she should do, I think she would really be looking at things like just hitting the streets, talking to people, viewing the competition, looking into what was in the area before, what's in the area already, seeing who's come and going in the local area. And it's about not starting with assumptions, which again is something that can be very difficult, but it's also why a lot of new businesses fail. You need to be able to challenge your ideas in order to validate them objectively. So if we continue using the example of Becca and her cafe, what problem is she solving? What need is she trying to meet? And research always needs to come back to answering these questions. And if you can't do this, then you have to accept the fact that the idea that you've got might not have enough value. Because from the point of view of finding your customer, this type of research ensures that you're starting to establish who your customer is or who your customer is not, and where your customer is or is not. And I think, as in Becca's case, she would have gone in with the assumption that her customer is potentially everybody or anybody. And if you come in with that strategy and try and continue to work with it, then you don't have a strategy at all. And again, Ben's going to come on to talk about strategy and marketing strategy shortly. So let's have a look at some of the sort of questions that Becca could have asked. So even just out on the street, sort of talking to people coming and going in the town or around the other cafes in the area, she could have just vox popped people and asked them questions randomly. People do generally like to have a chat, so you can usually find people who will talk to you and answer questions for you. But if you have a look at the screen, there's some examples there of closed questions and open questions. Now, the closed questions allow for limited answers, so normally yes or no or some sort of elaboration of this. And in this example, the closed questions are led by our assumptions. So, do you like to drink quality coffee? Do you go to nice coffee shops? We're introducing that element of luxury. We haven't asked a question that allows us to gain that information. We've already biased the answer by asking it in that way. So if we ask in that way, then we're sort of believing our own assumptions already because we haven't asked an open question. If we look at the open questions, they come from a neutral viewpoint. What did you do in reality? What happened in reality? So tell me about the last time you went for coffee. What did you do? What happened next? We haven't sort of put any kind of bias there at all.
Yeah, sorry, I'll just one important point here that I just want to jump in that's popped into my mind. With this, I think a way to understand the difference between the closed and the open questions, and a great starting point that certainly worked for me, is to ask people what they have done in a situation rather than what they might do. So that's all I just wanted to add.
Yeah, I think
what would they do is it leads people to sort of conjecture about a possible future that then doesn't actually transpire to be true, because people often say things and do something completely different in real life. That's what we're trying to illustrate here.
Yeah. Because if you're looking at it in the future, you're almost looking at a theoretical sort of perfect version of yourself and what you would like to do rather than what you actually have done in reality. So yeah, that's a good point. And I think if you look at the question examples on the screen, you can see that the open questions reveal that the person answering the question actually values convenience and consistency more. Whereas the closed questions have only sort of asked in a way that would make you think that you had a connoisseur on your hands. Whereas if the open questions give a much more sort of real view that we don't have a connoisseur, we just have a weary shopper. I think to help put this into real context, I'm going to ask Ben to come in again and just talk about some of his recent experience of real customer interviews. Would you mind doing that, Ben?
Yeah. Sure. So as a part of my role at Sun Spiral is to work with lots of different project teams and different organizations, doing something that I would call product management. And part of product management is customer engagement. And the particular specific project that I'm actually involved with is a piece of software for I would say the civil engineering and sort of groundworks industries. So whenever they build a housing development or a new road or rail or a Tesco down the road, they obviously have to check the ground conditions. And what they do is they go out and drill holes and then log those and then put them into a digital computer system, hopefully. I mean, some people still work on paper, but so I'm working with a small team to see if we can identify and bring a new piece of software to the market for that, because one of the issues at the moment with that specific industry is there isn't actually much choice for software solutions, and this is kind of quite a technical area. So basically, just to say that the technique that we've used to define how we're going to approach this problem as a product development team has been through basically what we call customer interviews. So this might seem slightly, I'm not quite sure what the word is, not counterintuitive, but what a lot of business training will suggest that you can do is basically just do the secondary market research that Tracee mentioned. So you can just literally look at secondary materials, or you can just do an online search, or you can read some research report to get all the information you need. My experience of this particular project is that just isn't true. It's a cheap, good starting point. It's a broad brush to say, is it worth even going in this area? What does the landscape look like? The experience I've had on this project with customer interviews has been absolutely invaluable, and it's helped us to refine basically what I'm going to talk about in a moment, is like how are we going to position in the market, which we'll come on to in a minute. I just want to take a moment here. The reason why Tracee's put this slide up here with this specific project is really an aid memoir for me to say, what does a customer interview look like? So if you've never considered this before, it has lots of value in lots of different ways. And the idea is that you will actually have, ideally, a conversation in real life, or if not, through like a phone call, or even, a video call, something like that is fine. But if you can actually go out and meet potential customers, sort of one-on-one, I would advise, or if you're a small team of 2 or 3, that's fine as well. And just talk to individual customers or individual companies in small, sort of, I'd say 1-to-1 or like 2-to-2 groups. And because other techniques you might have come across are things like surveys, or you could do a survey in person, or you could do a survey online, or things like focus groups. Neither of those are as powerful at the early stage of validating your idea as just one-to-one conversations with people with open questions. So it's just to reiterate that point, and that's how we've got to our positioning with this Pangolin Geo project, where we're positioning around simplicity. So it's, rather than thinking about the functionality that we need to go into a piece of technical software, all of our customer interviews very quickly showed us that simplicity is the key behavioral driver for what people want in that industry. So we're going to explore that in a bit more structure in terms of marketing theory. So these are terms that you might have come across before: segmentation, targeting, and positioning. So these are the core of marketing strategy. There's an interesting question which I'm just going to answer now. So Andreas has asked, how do you access the people to interview? My target market, for example, is farmers, and I struggle to get in front of them in the first place. That is a thorny question. Yes, that is an interesting one. I mean, obviously, if you have, in the case of my project, I already had a professional network where I could kind of tap a few people up and hassle them into doing it. Other ways of doing this is you can sort of do it online. So, for example, you could run a Facebook advert, let's say, if you think your potential customers looking at Facebook, asking for customer interviews. And if you've got a small budget for this, you could say, here's a £5 Amazon voucher. There are tools, I think, to do that in things like Facebook. So if you're really, really struggling to get contact with those target customers, you might have to give them a little bit of an incentive and do something like that. The bit I would say to sort of reassure you about this is you don't need lots and lots of interviews at this stage. You maybe need, let's say, 4 or 5 or 6 will get you off to a great start. You don't need to do hundreds of these. And just get out there, maybe even just be a bit of a nuisance to people. You could turn up at some trade shows, for example, see if you can find some people sitting around having coffee, see if they'll talk to you. It can feel slightly uncomfortable, but that is unfortunately just part of the process. It's something you have to go through. You're going to have to find a way to get in front of people. And like with the cafe example, you might just have to go to a cafe and start talking to people, or you might have to stand in the street and try and stop people from walking past. It's the trickiest bit, but it's the most valuable bit. So the segmentation, targeting, and positioning are the core of the strategy. And through all of our research, when we're talking to our customers and prospective customers, as well as establishing viability, we also need to be trying to establish the most attractive market for our product or service, or that we might build a product or service for. And as we said earlier, a business that thinks everyone and anyone is their customer will probably offer just anything they've got within their remit, because they haven't established what people want or need, just what they're able to offer. So this is the supply side versus demand side thing again. And the core of this marketing strategy is we need to try to establish first what types of customers exist, and then think about which ones we want to focus on and what we want to stand for. So segmentation is not, it's the starting point of strategy, but it isn't the decision making. It's just drawing a map of the territory. What types of customers exist and can we categorize them? Targeting is where we start to make strategic decisions. So which ones are we actually going to go after and try and build a business around? And then how are we going to stand out? So what are we going to stand for? What's our unique position? And that is a function of brand, but also what products or services we bring to market for those customers. So let's have a look at segmentation. Basically, what we're trying to do is use our market research to reveal the various ways that different people decide to buy different things. So it's sort of buying behavior. So that we can talk about, for example, their aspirations or their frustrations or their pain points is another way you might see this described. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a map, or we're trying to categorize people based on their buying behaviors. Okay, so it's just to get you to think about this a little bit, because this will look different for different industries. But people might buy on different attributes like price, for example, or quality, or they might buy on convenience, or they might buy because of good design, for example. And the segmentation needs to be based on not just your assumptions and not just demographics. Well, I'll explore that again in a moment, but it needs to be based on the things that they're really struggling with or they're really aspiring to and their buying behaviors. So this is where a lot of people fall down with this core of the marketing strategy. With the segmentation, there's a massive temptation to go for demographics, which is a bit of a trap. So by demographics, I mean you're slicing the market by, let's say, age group or location or something like that, some obvious attribute. There's a lot of research to suggest that those attributes don't tally very well with buying behavior. So this is the point, and this is a conceptual part of the training course. This becomes more obvious if you do the market research bit, because then you will start to see clear patterns. You know, are there people who value speed or convenience? Are there people who really value quality? If you get into the trap of thinking, oh, well, my target segment is going to be Gen Z, for example, it turns out there's a lot of evidence it's not a meaningful customer segment at all, because people within different age groups will buy in similar ways. It doesn't fall down to just demographics, so just be aware of that. And the market research is the antidote to that sort of demographic thinking. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the information you've gained in your research to group the customers based on these behaviors and attitudes. So, you know, what do people care about? What causes someone to buy one product from one supplier or a different product from another supplier, or use one cafe versus another cafe? And let's take Becca's example again. A good idea with this, once you've done your market research, some sort of themes will start to speak to you, and you'll start to have groups in your mind, and you can make a list of these. What I would advise is giving them a bit of a quirky name that brings them to life. So this is just obviously a fiction example based on Becca's Cafe. The good thing with this way of listing them is it kind of forces you to think about the behavioral attributes of these segments. So rather than just having a list saying, you know, 18 to 26-year-olds, it's like, well, different 18 to 26-year-olds behave differently based on many, many factors. But as soon as you've got this list here where you're starting to think about the types of people and how they might behave, it forces you to think more in that behavioral way rather than the demographic way. And it might sound frivolous, but this is partly about you as well. It's partly getting you to slow down and think, what do these people care about? What sort of attributes are they going to care about? And we'll come on to why that's important in a moment, and how we're going to use this information strategically. So, so at this point, before we haven't made any decisions about who the target customer is. We've just described the customers that we think exist in the market, and that's an important step. Because the thing with the marketing strategy, it's very easy to jump in at the wrong point and not follow a rigorous process. But now we get to the strategy bit. The map of the territory is the list of all the different segments of customers that we think exist. And we might not have that perfect, but at least we've done some rigorous work based on market research. Now it's time to think about where we're going to go on that map, on that territory, okay? Because we can't serve every customer, because if we're trying to serve every customer, by definition, we don't have a strategy. Okay, so keep our segments in mind, because they're still important as we come on to targeting, which is the second element of the marketing strategy. And all targeting means is making a choice about which segments you're going to focus on, okay? Because we only have limited resources. We can't serve every single customer. So we're going to target some segments, okay? So how do we choose this? It's about choosing segments that seem the most worth focusing on, basically. So this is also part of the rigorous process. They're not the segments that you most necessarily identify with or that are most like you. You have to be objective about this. So segments might be attractive if they're, for example, large or growing, okay? Or if the particular segment you think is less sensitive to higher prices, that can be very important for profitability. Or if you as a business, for some reason, have got a way to service that particular segment with lower costs than the competitors. Or, as is often the case actually, if the competition is just lazy and isn't serving that particular segment or segments very well. So it's generally best to choose the most attractive segment or segments that you can handle, but not just the ones that just sound best to you. Okay, so you've got to think about, are there enough of them? Will they pay the higher prices? Can you make them profitable? And you can pick more than one segment, by the way. You don't just have to pick one, but they should be slightly related to each other, what we might call adjacent to one another in terms of your products and services. So if we look at who Becca could choose to target, we can instantly see, because we use these names that might have seemed slightly quirky and frivolous 2 slides ago, these now start to make a bit more sense. Because with those names, it's very quickly apparent which ones fit together and which ones don't. So we can take some care when grouping the segments together. So on the left, we've got some potential clashes. So if Becca wanted to target young parent weekly social clubbers and the War and Peace reading peace seekers, okay, so we've got people who are going to come and potentially create quite a lot of noise and take a lot of space up in a cafe. And we're trying to pair those in our targeting with people who want to sit quietly in a corner and read a book. So we can straight away see that we might want to have a strategy that attracts those 2 segments into the same place. And on the right, you can maybe see, here we've got 3 that might, in green, that might actually work quite well together. So we've got fashionistas who love talented baristas, slightly quirky name, but basically we're saying, you know, people who like to dress up nicely and go out for a coffee and enjoy a high quality product. You've got people coming in there, Silicon Valley startup dudes to sit on their MacBooks and work with a nice coffee, and people who care about particular food choices, for example, so the vegan vigilantes. And it turns out potentially, and this is a fictional example, that these segments might all value similar things. So they might value interesting menu options, they might value high quality products and nice surroundings, so well-designed interior fit out and luxury fittings, for example. And the point of this is, if you can group this, you can target segments which value a particular set of things that you can then start to position around them. And that enables you also to charge higher prices. So the third element, so we've had segmentation, targeting. Now the third element is positioning, the core of the marketing strategy. If you've chosen who the customer is, how are you going to attract them? So the key to this is to decide on your core attributes. So are you going for quality, or are you going for low price, for example? Are you going for range? or are you going for simplicity? You must clearly signal these core attributes to your target customer. And you have to try and do this in a distinctive way so that they remember you. So pick a small number of attributes to focus on for your target segments, and make sure these are the reasons for your target customers to pick you and not the competition. So it's a kind of a bit about being distinctive and giving them a reason to choose you. So okay. So in terms of Becca's positioning, let's say Becca's chosen to target fashionistas, the startup guys, and the vegans. What might these segments all value? Let's say it's quality, design, and plant-based options. The good thing about this, if we've gone through the 3 steps of segmenting, targeting, and then choosing our position, is that every single decision you make then in your implementation of your product or service can be referred back to those attributes. So it just makes the decision-making easier, because everything you choose to do, every step you take about your product or your surroundings or what location you choose can be guided by those attributes, and it just makes your decision-making easier. Okay. Because if the problem is, if you don't do this, if you don't give people a specific reason to use you, if you're not being distinctive, if you don't have a point of view and you don't know who you're targeting, you're simply blending in with the crowd. And the problem with that is people aren't sure why they should use you or not. You become a commodity, you can't charge a higher price, and so on. So Tracee's now going to kind of flesh this out with another fictional example.
Yeah, okay, so we've got the example of Frankie here. So Frankie is a plumber and he owns ABC Plumbing. He qualified recently and started setting up on his own. He advertises in the local press and online, no job too big or small. Frankie gets a lot of business because plumbers are always in demand, but he has a high churn and a very varied workload that offers low margins and consequently less profits. He sometimes doesn't know where he'll be working from one day to the next, or what he's going to be doing from one day to the next, which is very stressful. And as Ben said, he's become a commodity. And he's made his service a commodity, really, by not specializing, so by not narrowing down what his offering is, what he stands for. Frankie knows that even from a small amount of online research that plumbers are in demand, but he hasn't looked into what kind of demands people have and customers have. So he's therefore having to make do with whatever work that he's offered. So as we've said a couple of times now, thinking that your customer is everybody or anybody means that you don't have a strategy. And a strategy, as Ben said, is effectively a decision to focus on a specific thing or a limited number of things, which will enable you to establish your distinct point of view. So what Frankie needs to do is talk to his customers to allow him to find out what they care about, to narrow down his focus and establish whether there are any better gaps in the market that he could be exploiting. And by doing this, he can better tailor his marketing strategy, so his distinct point of view, and then benefit from higher margins, higher profits, and lower churn. So just as an example for Frankie, he might find that by talking to people in town where there's a lot of listed buildings, so say he lives in Kings Lynn, like we do, there are a lot of historical buildings in Kings Lynn, he might find that actually he can specialize in that area. A historical building specialism may make sense, and that gives him a position. And once he has a position, he can then live and breathe that position. So if he positions himself, say, as a historical building specialist at the higher end of specialist services, he needs to make sure that his branding, his marketing, his services, his demeanor, everything about his business and who he is, he needs to make sure that he reflects this. And that should stop him then having to have that churn. And as Ben said, it's about being able to sort of use that to be able to charge higher prices and also have a more meaningful body of work as well. Another thing that you can do at this point is prototyping. Now, I think if you're trying to find out if there's a market at all for your product, I think that this is where prototyping would come in. It wouldn't be relevant to Frankie because Frankie already sort of knows that there's a market out there for him. But say, you've got a product or a service and you're not sure if there's a market out there at all, then prototyping is a way to sort of start finding out what you can do with that product. So if you don't have an existing customer base, you can use prototyping to find out if there's a market. And you can start with a small thing that you can get in front of customers without too much investment that will help you to validate the demand for your idea by basically offering the customer a version of your product and then asking them about it. So I've put a picture of an innocent smoothie there. Some of you may already know about the background of innocent smoothie and how they started. Basically in the late 90s, they went to a fair, I think it was a jazz festival or something, and they asked people whether they should give up their day jobs and focus on the smoothie business full time. And they did this by giving them a drink and asking them to put their empty bottle in one of two bins marked yes or no. Should I give up the day job? Yes or no? And it was overwhelmingly yes, they should. And obviously, while this is only a very small piece of the research that they would have done, it shows the value of prototyping. So let's look just at another example on prototyping. So this is Elsa. So Elsa makes bunting. She's very good at making bunting and has done it in the past for friends and family as gifts, and everybody seems to like it. One of her friends asked her to make bunting for her wedding, and since then Elsa's considered starting a business making high quality occasion bunting. So what strategy should Elsa take? Well, strategies about picking, looking at a small number of reasons why people are buying bunting and positioning against those reasons. So what she's doing is using a prototype to start researching the question, why do people buy bunting? So traditional vibes, to impress other people, it's environmentally sound. So, secondary research can help her with all that, but she also needs to do that primary research as well. But prototyping will be sort of putting some things together, doing craft fairs, doing markets, putting it on Etsy, and then being able to get feedback from people to find out whether it's a viable idea or not. And as she sells things, she'll need to sort of learn things as well. So she'll find out why people are buying it, where they normally shop for those kind of products, how often they shop for it, what purpose it offers. And again, as Ben brought up in relation to something else as well, it might not be the reason that she thinks it is. So it's about testing her assumptions, about specializing, as well as what or who her market might be. And I think it is a mindset shift because it helps break the dependence on the thought of, if I make it, they will buy it, and be realistic about whether there is a market for the service.
Yeah, it's an interesting question that's come in the chat actually from Felicia. So I'll just take a moment to consider that. How and where do you test a prototype of a service? That's quite an interesting question. I think it depends on the specific context, but just off the top of my head, some ideas. I think you just have to get slightly creative with this. So a prototype doesn't have to be a model of the literal product or service that you're going to actually eventually offer to the market. So we take the innocent smoothie one. Yes, they made some smoothies, but they were testing, basically the prototype was the bucket that said yes and no. So they weren't, as you'll notice, they weren't trying to get their product into stores in order to see if people liked it. They were doing this in creative ways. So in terms of a service, there's interesting ways you can do this kind of stuff. So, for example, you could make a landing page, let's say like a web page or something like that, for something that looks a bit like the service that you're going to provide. So I'm not quite sure what sort of service you mean, whether this is like a consulting service or whether it's an online service. I'm not sure, but you can basically get people to take one small action based on Okay, so consulting service. So you could basically make a small, let's say, almost like a little marketing campaign before you even really rolled the service out as a thing that your company does. And you can just see if you can attract people to a landing page, for example. That's just one idea. I'll have to try and see if I can think of a couple more over the next few minutes. But you just have to try and get creative with it. And it's about, I mean, maybe you could start building a mailing list and see if you can get people to click through onto something. So it's about thinking a little bit laterally and a bit off to the side. It's not necessarily building the service or building the product and then trying to sell it. It can be just about getting people to take a small action in the direction of your service to prove that you can start to attract some interest. And so it can be almost like a sort of facade. Let's say if it's a website or something you're trying to attract people to for your consulting service, you can make a facade. You don't have to spend a lot of money building it all out and then being prepared for all of those consulting customers. You can just put something out there, or even like a survey or something, just get people to interact and start to draw them in a little bit and see how people react to something as if it was there. Let's say it was a training course, for example, you're going to do an online training course or a workshop. You could do it kind of like pre-sales. You could try to get people to click through to say, register interest, pre-sales kind of thing. You don't have to actually build it all before you start to do this. That's what we mean by prototyping, because I think the traditional view of prototyping is like a physical product, right, where you're going to build a model of it or a basic functioning version. And obviously that is one example, but with sort of softer things or more sort of things like services, you need to find more creative ways of doing it, I think. And it's about testing assumptions and breaking down risks without spending a lot of money, basically.
Yeah. I think, like you say, the word prototype can be misconstrued, can't it? Because it seems like it's going to mean some sort of model or test version of something, really. I think I've put the words proof of concept up there on the screen, but I think that's possibly a better way of looking at it. So what you're trying to do is gain evidence as an experiment or pilot project to demonstrate that a concept is feasible. So we've rattled through an awful lot there, haven't we, in quite a short period of time? Well, we've gone to an hour now, so we'll move on to Q&A shortly, but I'll just let Ben recap what we've been talking about today to put everything into better context.
Yeah, thanks, Tracee. So we're nearly at the end, so I think it's just worth just sort of summarising what the key points were that we've been through here. And the starting point is to focus on the market and try to establish if there's demand for your idea, because the problem is that ideas, in the nicest possible way, ideas are cheap. What you need to try and do is to validate them objectively, and the best way to do this is to adopt this market orientation. Another way to phrase that is to be customer focused, but we like to use the word market orientation because it reminds you that there has to be a market for your product or service. Once you've taken that, it's more like a mindset shift, isn't it? You need to shift into that mindset that you're not the customer, and you need to go out and meet the customer in the real world on their terms and try to understand what they care about. And the way to do this is to do your market research. And the trick here is to try to do this objectively, use a combination of primary and secondary research. One thing we didn't quite touch on is the idea actually of quantitative research. So within the primary and secondary, you can do both qualitative and quantitative. If you're at an early stage, the qualitative or the subjective, the talking to people, is by far and away much more valuable than any kind of statistics you can gather. Down the line, once you've got the ball rolling, obviously you can put surveys out and things like that and gather numbers. But unless you've validated your idea, and the best way to do that is with primary research, customer one-to-ones, start there. Talk to prospective customers. It's just the best way to do it. When you're doing that, this is hard, I find this difficult as well, try to use open questions. Don't lead people down the garden path to your point of view. Don't have an idea in mind for what you're going to build. Just ask them about their reality. And remember that little tip we gave you. Ask them what they have done in the past in real life, rather than what they might do in the future if you were to build something for them. that can be massively powerful. It's a big shift, subtle but powerful. And then try to base your marketing strategy off that. So figure out who's in the market, make a map of the territory, what types of customers exist, what do they care about, and then go for your targets. Go for ones which are the most attractive, not the ones that you think just look nicest, but it needs to be a function of, is the segment big enough? Can I approach that segment, or is it a walled garden? Be careful of those. So can you actually approach them in some way? Will they pay a high enough price for your product or service as well? Okay. And then go about the process of offering that product or service to a specific group of people who really want the problem solving or really have an aspiration for something that you can address. And just be distinctive as you do it. So think about your positioning. What attributes, what are your core attributes and values? And then as you go, don't just build the whole thing out and then see if anybody wants it. Test it step by step, use the prototyping techniques, try and get creative with that and test and learn as you go. So that's the detail for now. If anyone wants a little bit more information about what we do at Sun Spiral, please do have a little look at the website if you haven't already, which is sunspiral.co.uk. And also get in touch with us. We're very happy for anyone on the call if you'd just like a free sort of 30-minute, no obligation Zoom call, or we'll, if you're in the area, we're based in King's Lynn, happy to meet for a coffee in town or wherever and have a chat with you about your idea. No strings attached. We just like talking to people and learning about what people are trying to build businesses around.
Lovely. So that's it from us, really. It's over to you guys now if you've got any questions or anything that you want to sort of clarify or discuss further. I'll close the slides actually and then put the video back on. So
thank you. That's fantastic. That was a brilliant session. I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. Has anyone got any great questions they want to? There was a couple in the chat I saw, but has anyone got any other questions they want to fire at Ben and Tracee while we have them captive here? Thanks there from Kirsty. So one of the I was very interesting. I'm really interesting about the idea about not imposing your ideas on it, which I think is particularly interesting for me because it's something I'm guilty of all the time. As anybody knows,
it's human nature a little bit.
Yeah.
And
I'm really, really fascinated by you sort of going back to doing one-to-ones with people, because I mean, I'm even like, and we advocate using things like Mintel as a sort of market research thing, but they do have these very broad categories, these Generation Z and baby boomers, and it is a bit guilty of being one size fits all, isn't it? I think you have to be careful of that. But how do you sort of like go get mitigating against even things about your age, your gender, your class, your ethnicity? How do you sort of guard against sort of going down the sort of rabbit hole of what you know? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to that is actually quite simple. I think it is the customer interviews, and I know it's a very difficult bit, and it's not very commonly used. And I think because it is quite, I mean, I'm quite introverted, and it's definitely outside of my comfort zone to go and find those people. But it's the best way to break down that set of assumptions and that bias that you have about you think you just know what the solution is for this market. Yeah. And there's a couple of things in there. So you mentioned like the big market research reports that you can read. They're great for just general background, sort of broad brush. But one of the problems we've observed that people have with that is they read through them and then they start to think, okay, my strategy needs to be, I need to gain X% market share of this industry. And that's my strategy, for example. So you might say, this is a multi-billion pound market. So surely I can attract 1% of it. But you won't, because you don't have a point of view and you don't know what specific problem you're solving. And this is a thing that's repeated over and over. And even some, big, well-established companies make this mistake. It's repeated over and over through the ages. If you stick to just numbers like X% of market share, target age group 18 to 26, it's fundamentally flawed. It's a part of the equation. And I would just say that the simple answer to that, especially for people like us and the people on the call who are probably either just starting out or have relatively small businesses, you're in a massively advantageous position because you can make the rules up. You can go and find people, you can have conversations. Bigger companies struggle with that for various reasons, you know, the way they're set up, the rules they have, the fact that they might be intimidating to customers. We as small business owners are actually, we have an advantage. We can move fast, we can have little conversations with people. And the other advantage with this, besides breaking down the assumptions that you might have about what the market looks like and what your strategy should be, it's also really motivating. And I've seen this a lot over the years, that even people who are very reluctant initially to have those conversations because they don't think they're going to be valuable, or they think they're going to be too subjective, or because they're introverted or shy and they don't want to have them. When you have that conversation, when you realize it's actually not that hard once you're talking, you start to empathize with the customer and you start to care about their world. So, I mean, customer interviews, you can expand them as well. They don't just have to be 30 minutes. You go and visit them at their premises. Yeah. Watch them doing the job. See where are they getting frustrated? What are they annoyed about? Or what do they wish would happen? And you won't get that insight if you just sit and read a report.
Yeah, I mean, do you find yourself? I mean, I do this. Do you find you're always, like, wherever you are, you're interacting with people and asking questions? You know, if you're out shopping or out, do you find you're constantly looking for people and asking their opinions and getting feedback?
Yeah, definitely. And this is one of the problems. I mean, I'm a slight sort of marketing geek, and I don't know where it came from. It's only happened to me in the last few years, but you start to see everything through a marketing lens, and it sounds a bit dull, but actually it's quite interesting because it's all about people. And it becomes like, if you're interested in psychology as well, there are psychological elements to it. Like, why do people choose particular brands? Why do people make certain decisions? And you start to see opportunities to learn things everywhere you go. Yeah. You know, sit in a cafe and watch what happens. What sorts of people are coming in? Can you have a conversation with them? And yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Are there any other? Has anyone else got any other questions before I stop talking? Or if you're too shy, put them in the chat if you got anything. But I mean, if anyone comes up with anything after the event, I'm sure Ben and Tracee will be happy to answer any other questions after the event. If you're not keen to.
There's a link to our email address on the website. So if anyone does, you know, even if it's just what seems like a silly question, just drop us an email and we'll be happy to either answer it or get in touch and have a bit of a chat. That's fine. Yeah,
that's great. I suppose I think a lot of bigger companies, I suppose when they go on, they actually try and change customer behaviour rather than actually asking what customers want, don't they? I suppose the bigger the company they are, they're more likely to, you know, to try and do that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and maybe if you're that big, you get away with that for a while. Yeah. You might get away with it for 20 years, but ultimately you're not going to get away with it.
Yeah, I was listening about the Amazon stores where you just go into like a food shop and you just take stuff off the shelves and it's all automatically takes it off your phone. Well, they've shelved opening so many of them there because it hasn't really there was a corner of people who liked it, but it didn't reach out to a wider range of people, a wider demographic than just people who like doing the latest thing.
Yeah, that's it. That's another thing we actually didn't really touch on, but it's quite important that people often think, so we talk about innovation, and when you talk about innovation to a lot of people, they kind of equate that with invention or technology, for example, and it's not really about that. And that's another classic trap. Thinking of a technology and then seeing if you can apply it to something and build a business around it, rather than starting with the customer and then figuring out the best technology to solve their problems. Yeah. So it's a kind of a 180. You look at it, always look at everything through the lens of the customer, and you won't fall into that trap.
We have a little bit of that with our intellectual property sessions that we do. People who are interested in patents and stuff, but they're not actually interested. They just want to register the technology. They're not interested in the business side of it. They just want to stop someone else from using it, but they're not interested in it. They don't have a focus of what they want to do with it. Anyway, I'm digressing as usual. So if no one's got any more questions,
it looks like Andreas has got his hand up too.
Andreas, sorry, Andreas.
No worries. First of all, thank you for the session. Could I just ask you to share kind of the link and detail? There was some mention of LinkedIn as well in the chat again. I lost connection at some point, so I can't see that anymore.
I'll put that back in I'll just paste that back into the chat so that you've got our LinkedIn profile.
Thank you. Yeah, I think some of us who might have joined slightly later wouldn't have seen it. That's great. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Andreas.
Thanks, Andreas. Yeah.
That's great. Well, I'd just like to say a very, very big thank you to Ben and Tracee. It's a fascinating session. I found that really, really interesting myself. And I like that kind of micro attitude to, well, life, full stop, really, rather than of talking one-to-one and finding out your customers like that. I really enjoyed that. So thank you very much.